Today we're looking at the outcome of the Civil War. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bell Ringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and take a look at the questions down in the description. So the Civil War was fought between the Northern Union and the Southern Confederacy and lasted from 1861 to 1865. The war ended in victory for the North and the Union was maintained, but arguably the most important outcome of the war was the abolition or elimination of slavery. But unfortunately, despite the fact that slavery was eliminated, the war then ushered in an era of discrimination and unequal treatment for African Americans. The nation had also gone through a national tragedy unlike Americans had ever experienced, and many of the war's leaders would go on to shape the country's future. The war itself was absolutely massive, with an estimated 3 million Americans that fought in it, roughly 2 million for the Union and 1 million for the Confederacy. The Civil War was also the bloodiest in American history, primarily because Civil War commanders were using outdated tactics for the weapons that they were using. Estimates are that 620,000 Americans died in the war, but recent research suggests that a total could be as high as 750,000 Americans were killed in the war. Most soldiers that fell in the field were buried near the battle site or in graves near Civil War hospitals. After the war was over, entire Union armies were dispatched into the South to clean up battlefields and attempt to identify the dead and bury them properly. It goes without saying that with so many fallen soldiers, there were thousands that were left in unidentified or mass graves. Of course, right as the war ended, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln had wished to treat the South with compassion and not exact vengeance for what had occurred. Now, without Lincoln, a group of congressmen known as the Radical Republicans came into power, and they very much wanted to make the South pay for what they had done. This begins a time period known as Reconstruction, where the nation was trying to rebuild itself. But that time period is going to have to be an entirely different series of videos. But much of the Reconstruction plan revolved around former Confederates signing a loyalty oath to the United States in order to get citizenship again. Confederate President Jefferson Davis fled Richmond and was captured in Georgia in May of 1865. He was convicted of treason and sentenced to prison at Fort Monroe, Virginia. He was released in 1867 but never regained his citizenship because he refused to take an oath to the federal government. He died in 1889, basically living off the charity of friends and family. Robert E. Lee was pardoned or forgiven of his involvement in the war. He went on to become the president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. He did sign a loyalty oath, but interestingly, it was lost and not found for 100 years. Lee died of heart failure in 1870 at the age of 63. Ulysses S. Grant, of course, went on to become the 18th president of the United States from 1869 to 1877. He attempted to work the nation back together through Reconstruction and tried to protect the rights of African Americans, but his administration was plagued with corruption. Grant was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1884 and died in 1885 at the age of 63. As the war was nearing its end in the winter of 1865, President Lincoln was pushing frantically to get the 13th Amendment added to the Constitution, which would eliminate slavery in America. Lincoln knew his Emancipation Proclamation would not hold up after the war was over because it was basically a military measure, and if there was no fighting, slavery could possibly return. On January 31st, 1865, the amendment got the required two-thirds majority vote in the House of Representatives. It had already passed in the Senate. The amendment formally abolished slavery. One of the main conditions for Southern states to rejoin was that they had to ratify or approve the 13th Amendment, and by the end of 1865, all Southern states had done so. Now, here is the huge issue that comes up. Despite slavery officially being abolished, Southern states began passing laws within their own states known as black codes. The main purpose of these laws were to keep former enslaved people in poverty and basically under the control of white Southerners. Some examples of these laws were African Americans could not own property, could not serve on juries, and African Americans had to sign contracts saying that they worked for a landlord or a white Southern landowner, and if they did not have a contract, they were declared vagrant and were arrested. Most of these black code laws were not in effect for very long because northern leaders recognized what was happening and stepped in to eliminate them. But gradually those laws were replaced by what became known as Jim Crow laws that again discriminated heavily against African Americans. The wounds of the Civil War would not heal for a long time, and many feel that they haven't even healed to this day. The Civil War did accomplish several things, though. First, slavery was officially abolished, but again, equal rights for all would be a long fight. Second, it answered the question from the Constitution of who was in charge, the states or the federal government. And with the Union, being maintained in the federal government demonstrated that it had the authority. Lastly, the Civil War proved that democracy could withstand such a disaster. The U.S. basically gained a new standing in the international world, and now with an expanding industrial economy, the war basically set the U.S. on a course to become an international superpower. So with that, hopefully you learned something, and thanks for watching.